made profits. But the problem was that money market mutual funds started to pop up. People would get much higher return than just 3%. People started pulling their money out of the S&Ls in droves. So the S&Ls basically said, well, if we're going to not just collapse now, we need to have permission to offer depositors a higher return. And we need to have permission to invest in something other than 30-year mortgages at 6% in an age of double-digit inflation. And obviously this can't work. This government-established business model can't possibly work. So the consensus began to develop that if we want to save these things, we got to change the rules. Now maybe they shouldn't have been saved. Maybe it was a bad idea. We'll never know because the free market was never able to test them. But the point is that if you wanted to save them, you would have to change the rules. And that's what so-called deregulation of the S&Ls amounted to. That they can offer a higher return and they can make different types of investments. Now you say, but that's terrible, they might take on more risk. Okay, but it's either that or they fail. What's your choice? And I have a choice of my own, but the point is that when the government modifies the government-established rules of a government-established institution whose deposits continue to be insured by the government, how is that the free market's fault? These things crisis. Well, I talked about that in my book Meltdown, which was 2 years ago, and what the causes of that were. And I explained that, this wasn't a matter of the government and the central bank were just innocent bystanders, just standing there, and suddenly a crisis occurred, which is how the government version of events always goes. It's always just standing there, searching for ways to help us, and then a tsunami of unexpected things occur. Okay, well, I just, come on now, again, we're not in 4th grade, and so I went through and talked about the Federal Reserve System and how it manipulates interest rates, and that interest rates are supposed to, as F.A. Hayek said, supposed to serve as a brake. They're supposed to serve as a brake on our ambitions and tell us not to go totally crazy in a bubble and mania and so on. There are certain types of investments that we should just quit putting our money into. But unfortunately, instead of getting any red lights, all the lights were green in the economy, thanks to Alan Greenspan, interestingly enough. Alan Greenspan throughout the 2000s, let's just keep the rates low, and instead of any adjustment, they get more and more green lights, people keep on doing it. And at that time, imagine trying to tell somebody in 2004 that it's not a sustainable way to live, to have no job, but to have 5 investment properties that you're purchasing on an interest-only basis, and you just expect that by sitting there, you're going to get rich. You get rich by just sitting. That's the new thing. We don't even have to work or produce things. You just buy these things and you sit. And if you were to say to somebody, someday, this is going to look like a 1950s haircut with the Brill cream. You're going to be so embarrassed by this. But you can't get them to listen. 2 nights ago, I was in a hotel in New York. And I just happened to be flipping through, and it was the Rachel Maddow show. And some guy, I don't know who this guy was, but I'm sure it's some guy who's not even entitled to an opinion on the subject. But some guy who was talking about the Republican Party, and he said, the Republican Party practically caused the financial crisis because of all their bank deregulation. And I thought, oh, give me just 2 minutes on this show. Okay, because this I want to talk about. You think, okay, you've got a packed room of people. You've got the C-SPAN 2 book TV audience, and you want to talk about bank deregulation? Oh, yes, I do. Precisely because I have so many people here. Because this is repeated all the time. From this kind of unstated assumption that just seems to form, and again, I understand why this would form somebody's philosophical makeup. This was all rammed into our heads when we were kids, but that there is no serious problem that our wise overlords couldn't have solved if they had just been given the power to crack a few more skulls. I mean, that's more or less the consensus. So let's look, let's look at this deregulation. Well, let's see, we had Regulation Q, which was mostly repealed under Jimmy Carter, which had limited the amount of interest that could be offered on savings deposits. Well, I don't think that's going to lead to a meltdown 3 decades later, so I don't think that's it. Then in 1994, restrictions on interstate branch banking, so branching across the country, were lifted. But from my vantage point, that actually makes the system more stable, because now the banks are less subject to regional and local and state fluctuations. So why would that cause the problem? And then finally, and this I am going to spend a few minutes on this, Finally, now the more clever ones will say, well, it was the repeal of Glass-Steagall that caused it. Now, most of the time, if you say to them, what was Glass-Steagall and what exactly was repealed, they will more or less say to you, hey, look over there and run away. I'm telling you, the people who give you this are bluffing. All right, so what was this Glass-Steagall thing? All right, 1933, it was a regulation that separated investment banking from commercial banking. So commercial banks could not deal in or underwrite securities, except basically riskless ones like government or government-supported securities. And investment banks couldn't offer deposits. And then finally, investment and commercial banks could not be controlled by the same holding company. That was basically what it is. So now, when we had the alleged repeal of Glass-Steagall, it was only that last one that was repealed. Just that last one. That now commercial investment banks can indeed be parented by the same holding company. Commercial banks are still forbidden to deal in securities. They can purchase them if they think they're good investments, and then they can sell them if they think they're no longer good investments or they need the cash. But they've always been allowed to do that. That's never been restricted. There is no repealed regulation that would have solved this problem. Banks were always allowed to securitize loans. They were always allowed to do the various things that they did. The relationship between investment and commercial banks had zero to do with the financial crisis. No commercial bank has enough assets to possibly do any serious damage to an investment bank, much less cause it to collapse entirely. And there are severe regulatory firewalls between the institutions that, again, make this entirely implausible. The financial crisis occurred because banks did a lousy job in traditional banking activities. They made bad loans. They weren't doing some newfangled thing that deregulation had made possible. There is no repealed regulation that you can point to that would have prevented this. In fact, if you look at the regulatory agencies that are in charge of the financial sector, in real terms, since 1980, funding for them has tripled. And moreover, Lawrence Kotlikoff at Boston University counts 115 agencies, regulatory agencies for financial services. So we're supposed to believe that things would have been a lot better if we had just had 116. That was the problem. Also, the regulators failed to identify the growing problems in the U.S. economy. Everything was fine and robust, we were told. Well, first, they were relying on the risk assessments of a small cartel of ratings agencies that were protected from competition. But secondly, they either grossly misread the condition of the housing market or they simply misled the public. I mean, Greenspan, in 2005, speaking on conditions in the housing market, described them as encouraging. In 2006, Ben Bernanke said, lending standards are sound. Lending standards in 2006 are sound. This guy needs more power, clearly. Clearly. But let's suppose regulators had been able to perceive the problem. Let's say the regime bothered to listen to people who make good predictions. Would they necessarily even know what the step to take to fix it, or would they have the courage even to try? Because consider, this is Russ Roberts, an economist at GMU. He says, a regulatory crackdown would have meant taking away a punch bowl filled with more home ownership, particularly among minorities, as well as expansion and profits in the business of home building, real estate brokerage, mortgage origination, and Wall Street financial engineering. Yeah, good luck with that. That's likely to happen. And then finally, all this prudential regulation that has to be input. Whenever you have a crazy non-free market banking system like we have, it's a cartel arrangement with the Fed at the center that props up all these crazy unsound banks. You need to impose all these prudential regulations to keep them from going completely crazy. And so the prudential regulations were supposed to say this, that for every $100 a bank holds in standard loans, it has to hold $10 in capital. For every $100 it holds in mortgages, it has to hold $5 in capital. But for every $100 it held in AAA-rated mortgage-backed securities, it had to hold only $2 in capital. You take a wild guess, what asset did they all flood into? And then when that one collapses, because of this regulatory situation, we have encouraged an almost mandatory herd mentality. Instead of people being normally diversified across various asset classes as they would normally be, everybody's in this. So the situation is even worse. The systemic risk is in fact increased by the government itself. And finally, we hear a lot about poor management in financial institutions. We've got a lot of bozos running the financial institutions. Maybe that's the case. But the current regulatory environment makes it basically impossible